Vacations are supposed to be an escape, right? A chance to breathe, to step away from the mess life throws at you. I needed that break more than ever. Everything had been unraveling. Divorce papers still gathering dust on my kitchen counter, a job hanging by a thread after the latest round of company restructuring. I felt like I was suffocating, so I decided to do something about it. Hawaii, sun, sand, and a hard reset. No emails, no stress, just me trying to stitch my sanity back together in a place where no one knew my name. Finding the right Airbnb was no easy feat. Most options were either absurdly overpriced tourist traps or rundown cabins pretending to be charming retreats. But then I stumbled across it, a beachfront two-bedroom house, just $100 a night. A price too good to ignore. The listing showed professional-grade photos, polished hardwood floors, an airy open-concept living space, massive windows framing an endless blue horizon. The few reviews it had were glowing, though strangely, none were recent. Maybe I was just lucky for once. Maybe, for the first time in a long time, the universe wasn't kicking me while I was down. The booking process was almost too easy. No long wait, no back and forth with the host. Just an instant confirmation and a neatly typed set of check-in instructions. A tiny voice in the back of my head nagged at me, whispered that something about this wasn't right. But desperation has a way of making you ignore the whispers, of dulling the part of you that warns when something doesn't add up. My flight left O'Hare early Wednesday morning. The journey was exhausting. Crying babies, a guy hacking his lungs out 2 rows behind me, turbulence bad enough to make me question my life choices. By the time we landed, I was running on fumes, surviving solely on cheap airport coffee and the promise of solitude. The rental car place handed me the keys to a battered old Civic that looked like it had been through one too many road trips. The air conditioning gasped rather than cooled, and a strange clicking noise rattled from the engine every few seconds. But it moved, and that was all that mattered. At first, the drive felt like every other vacation scene. Bright beaches, rows of palm trees, sunburned tourists snapping selfies. But the deeper I went, the more everything shifted. The roads grew narrower, patches of gravel replacing the smooth asphalt. The tropical greenery thickened around me, turning the path into a tunnel of leaves and vines that cast strange shadows over the car. My GPS flickered in and out, and for one sickening moment, I thought I'd lost it completely. Then, just as quickly as it vanished, the signal returned, and the robotic voice guided me forward, down a winding, overgrown road that looked untouched for years. You have arrived at your destination. The words echoed through the car as I pulled up and cut the engine. The house stood before me, and something inside me twisted. It was exactly like the photos, weathered blue siding, crisp white trim, a wraparound porch that probably gave breathtaking sunset views. But standing there, looking at it in real life, I felt something was wrong. The windows, dark and still, seemed to watch me, like a pair of unblinking eyes locked onto my every move. The wind murmured through the palms, and for a second, it sounded like voices whispering just out of earshot. I swallowed down my unease and popped the trunk. Just my imagination. Travel exhaustion messing with my head. I grabbed my bags and made my way up the steps. The key was supposed to be under a potted plant by the door, tucked inside one of those fake rocks that no one is ever actually fooled by. It was right where they said it would be, but as soon as my fingers touched it, I stopped. The rock was warm, too warm, warmer than it should have been, even in the relentless Hawaiian sun. The lock twisted with a sharp click, the sound unnervingly loud in the unnatural stillness. It was then that I noticed the silence. No birds singing, no rustling of wings in the trees. Weren't tropical islands supposed to be alive with the calls of birds? The absence of sound sent a prickle down my spine. The door groaned as it swung open, the creak long and drawn out, like something from an old horror film. A faint breeze carried in the salty tang of the ocean, but beneath it, another scent lingered, something older, something stale and damp, something I couldn't quite name. I reached blindly for the light switch, my fingers brushing the cool wall before finding it. A moment later, the bulbs above flickered reluctantly to life, their dim yellow glow stretching shadows long and jagged across the wooden floor. The air inside felt thick, unmoving, as though the house itself had been holding its breath. Shaking off the unease creeping along my skin, I grabbed my bags and carried them to what appeared to be the master bedroom. A king-sized bed sat in the center, its white sheets pulled impossibly tight, crisp enough to belong in a hospital. A private ensuite bathroom branched off to one side, and beyond the wide, dust-streaked windows lay the promised view of the endless ocean. But despite the room's picture-perfect setup, something felt off. The bed was too neat, too untouched, as if it had been waiting, just waiting for someone to disturb it. Exhaustion gnawed at the edges of my thoughts, but before unpacking, I decided to get a feel for the place. A quick walkthrough, just to shake the unease. The house was cozy, though that didn't quite put me at ease. The fireplace in the living room, the one from the listing photos, seemed out of place in the humid Hawaiian air. The kitchen gleamed with stainless steel appliances and granite countertops, polished to a mirror sheen, like something straight out of a high-end cooking show. The dining room, oddly formal for a beachfront rental, had a heavy wooden table set for 6, though I couldn't picture 6 people comfortably fitting in this house. It was strange. Every detail felt deliberate, placed with care, yet something beneath it all felt wrong. My throat was dry from the hours of travel, so I made my way to the kitchen in search of water. As I stepped inside, a soft hum filled the space. The refrigerator, its steady whir too precise, too controlled, almost as if it were deliberately trying not to make noise. The moment I pulled the door open, the interior light flickered twice, then steadied, casting a sickly glow over the mostly empty shelves. A few condiments lined the door, but other than that, the fridge was bare, except for a single bottle of white wine with no label. And then I saw it. Taped to the inside of the fridge door was an envelope, its paper yellowed and brittle at the edges, stained. Dark blotches spread across the corners, and I told myself, firmly, deliberately, that it was just water damage. But even as I thought it, my stomach twisted in doubt. My name was written on the front, Steve. The ink curled in elegant cursive, the kind no one teaches anymore, each letter precise and deliberate. My breath hitched, my pulse quickening. My hand hovered near the envelope, hesitant, unsure. In my line of work, insurance adjuster, unexpected letters were never good news. They meant problems, complications, something to worry about. But this wasn't work. This was vacation. And yet, every instinct screamed that I shouldn't touch it. But curiosity is a dangerous thing. It always wins. Slowly, I peeled the envelope from the fridge door, the adhesive resisting for just a moment before giving way. The paper felt strange. Not like normal paper, too thick, almost leathery under my fingertips. Swallowing hard, I slipped my fingers inside and pulled out a folded sheet. Unlike the envelope, the letter inside was newer, though still aged, its edges slightly curled. The moment I unfolded it, the crackling sound was unnaturally loud in the quiet house, almost like dry leaves crumbling between my fingers. The handwriting inside matched the envelopes, flawless, eerily neat, almost mechanical in its perfection. Hello, Steve. The words sent a slow, creeping chill down my spine. How long had this letter been here, waiting for me? I forced my eyes to keep reading. Thank you for choosing to stay at this Airbnb for the week. I hope your stay is a good one. But first, you must read the rules. Rule 1. We do not have a maid. If a tall woman in a maroon dress knocks on the front door claiming to be the maid, do not open the door. If the woman returns the next day, hide, preferably in a room with a lock. Rule 2. Never leave open food in the fridge for more than 2 days. Rule 3. If you wake up in the middle of the night and see a man in your kitchen, do not panic. Do not acknowledge him. He will be gone by morning. Rule 4. Don't step outside once the sun had set. Rule 5, however, sent a slow, creeping dread slithering up my spine. If you see a child in the pool, call the number on the fridge immediately. Someone will be sent to deal with it. My fingers clenched tighter around the letter as I read on, my eyes flicking nervously toward the kitchen, where the fridge loomed in my peripheral vision. The thought of needing to call someone to handle a child in the pool twisted my gut in ways I didn't like. Rule 6 was worse. If I ever walked upstairs and encountered a little girl clutching a teddy bear, I had to go straight into the first door on my left, retrieve a toy from a box, place it gently in front of her, and then leave, descending the stairs and waiting exactly 15 minutes. After that, it would be safe. But the rule didn't end there. Subsection 6A was tacked on in smaller writing, as if whoever penned it had hesitated before adding it. If the girl did not leave after I'd placed the toy, I was to run. Run and not stop. My breath grew shallow as I reached the final rule. Rule 7. Never enter the attic. No matter what noises you hear. That was it. No elaboration, no further warnings, just a firm final demand. And beneath it, in that same neat, impossibly precise handwriting, was a signature. Sincerely, the owner. I read through the note again, then again. Each time, my pulse hammered harder against my ribs. At first, I tried to convince myself it was a joke, some elaborate prank by locals to spook out-of-towners. Or maybe the owner had a dark sense of humor, using it as a gimmick to make guests remember their stay. But if that was the case, where was the punchline? Where was the part where it became funny? It wasn't. Something was wrong here. A heavy weight settled in my stomach, thick and leaden, as my rational mind scrambled to explain it away. Maybe it was a legal thing. A liability warning disguised as eerie instructions. Some oddball attempt at deterring guests from local wildlife, trespassers, or something else mundane. But another part of me, a deeper, more instinctive part, wasn't convinced. It whispered in the back of my mind, ancient and unshakable, the same primal fear that had kept humans wary of the dark for thousands of years. It told me to leave. I pulled my phone from my pocket, my hands clammy as I went to call the owner. Whether it was to demand answers or cancel my reservation outright, I wasn't sure. But the second I glanced at the screen, my stomach dropped. No signal. Frowning, I moved around the room, holding my phone high, angling it toward the windows, willing even the smallest flicker of reception to appear. Nothing. Just an empty signal bar staring back at me, taunting me. My jaw clenched. Fine. I'd find service outside if I had to. Then the doorbell rang. The chime cut through the house like a gunshot, loud and jarring in the oppressive silence. I jerked so violently that my phone slipped from my grip, crashing onto the hardwood floor. The screen lit up, still flashing that damn no service message. The bell rang again. This time, more insistent. A chill crawled up my spine, slow and deliberate. The air felt heavier, the walls pressing in ever so slightly. My pulse pounded in my ears as I crept toward the door, each step measured and hesitant. The floorboards beneath my feet, ones that had groaned under my weight earlier, remained eerily silent. That wasn't right. Swallowing hard, I reached the door and peered through the peephole. The distorted fisheye lens warped the image, but there was no mistaking what I saw. A woman stood on the porch, tall and rigid, dressed in a maroon gown that looked decades out of place. A wide-brimmed hat shielded most of her face, casting deep shadows that swallowed any discernible features. Her hands were folded neatly in front of her, motionless, as if she had been standing there for hours. She knocked again. 3 deliberate raps. The sound thrummed through my bones. Then she spoke. "Hello, sir," she said, her voice smooth, polite, practiced. "I'm the maid. I'm here to clean the house." A breath hitched in my throat. Rule number 1, we do not have a maid. Panic clawed at my chest, but I forced my voice to remain even. "There must be some mistake," I called, swallowing the fear that threatened to strangle me. I wasn't told about any maid service. Silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. The ocean waves which I had heard earlier now seemed impossibly distant. The quiet settled so deeply that I could hear the faint sound of my own pulse. Then, finally, she spoke again. "Sir," she said, but something had changed. The pleasantries were gone. Her voice was deeper now, rougher, as if she was struggling to recall what human speech was supposed to sound like. "I need to clean." A pause. "The house needs cleaning." Another pause. "Let me in." The knocking resumed, but this time it was nothing like the polite tapping from before. It was relentless, a rhythmic, hammering force that shook the door in its frame with each deafening impact. It was like a heartbeat, steady, powerful, unstoppable. The vibrations rattled through the wood, through the floor, through me. I stumbled back, my heel catching the edge of the rug, and before I could steady myself, I went down hard. The impact drove the breath from my lungs, leaving me gasping as I sprawled on the floor. But the pounding didn't stop. It kept going, over and over, a brutal cadence that made the walls tremble, the air itself feel thick with pressure. It went on for what felt like an eternity, stretching time into something unbearable, until, just as abruptly as it had started, it ceased. Silence crashed over the house like a wave, a deep, unnatural silence. No wind, no ocean, no hum of the refrigerator or creak of the cooling house. Nothing. I lay there, frozen, too afraid to move, barely daring to breathe. I strained my ears, listening for any sign of movement, of retreat, of something. But the world outside the door remained impossibly still. After what felt like hours, though in reality it had probably only been minutes, I forced myself to sit up. My limbs felt stiff, reluctant. But I had to know. Slowly, cautiously, I rose to my feet and crept toward the door, pressing my eye to the peephole once more. The porch was empty. A cold, creeping unease slithered down my spine. I spent the next hour pacing the house, checking and rechecking every lock, every window. My phone was still useless. No signal, not even a flicker. I tried the Wi-Fi next, using the password from the welcome packet, but it connected to nothing. No internet, no calls, no way to reach the outside world. I was completely isolated, trapped in a house with its strange, unsettling rules, and with something that had pretended to be a maid. Leaving should have been the obvious choice. I should have grabbed my keys, jumped into my car, and driven until I found civilization again. But I didn't. Something kept me there. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was something else. Something that had been waiting for me long before I ever arrived, ever saw that too good to be true listing. By late afternoon, the air inside had turned thick, heavy with humidity. The AC wheezed through the vents, struggling but failing to do much more than stir the stifling warmth around me. Sweat clung to my skin, making my clothes stick uncomfortably. A swim. The thought pushed into my mind, unbidden and insistent. A swim sounded good, too good. Despite everything that had happened, despite every instinct in my body screaming at me to stay cautious, the pool was calling to me. I had seen it from my bedroom window earlier, glistening under the afternoon sun, an oasis of blue in the oppressive heat. Right now, it seemed like the only escape from the weight pressing down on my chest. I changed into my swim trunks, grabbed a towel from the bathroom, and hesitated just long enough to notice that it smelled faintly of mothballs, like it had been sitting untouched for years. Then I stepped outside. The pool was smaller than it had looked from above, kidney-shaped, surrounded by cracked concrete that had seen better days. The water, though, perfectly clear, shimmering under the sun, inviting me closer. I dipped a toe in. The temperature was ideal. Within moments, I was in, cutting through the water, letting the sensation of weightlessness ease the tension in my body. Lap after lap, I swam, focusing on the movement, the rhythm, the simple, comforting normalcy of it. For the first time since arriving, I almost believed this was just an ordinary vacation. Then I saw him. I don't know when he appeared or how long he had been sitting there, watching me. A little boy, 7, maybe 8, sitting cross-legged at the pool's edge, completely silent. He wore nothing but a pair of red swim trunks, his skin so pale it almost seemed to glow in the fading sunlight. But it was his eyes that stopped me cold. They were wrong, dull, unfocused, like dusty marbles set into a porcelain doll's face. He wasn't looking at me, he was looking through me. His head tilted slightly, just enough to make me uneasy. It wasn't a natural tilt, not the way a child might move out of curiosity. It was off, too slow, too deliberate, too unnatural. I froze, my feet finding the pool's floor as I steadied myself. Rule 5 slammed into my mind with the force of a gunshot. If you see a little kid in the pool, call the number on the fridge. The boy's head tilted further, a grotesque, impossible angle that sent a jolt of raw fear through my spine. His ear nearly brushed his shoulder, and then his lips moved. No sound came out. Something inside me snapped. I lurched out of the water, stumbling onto the concrete, dripping and shaking. My towel was forgotten, my only thought to get inside, to reach the phone. My wet footprint smeared across the hardwood as I bolted for the kitchen. The number. It was there, still stuck to the fridge on a yellowed sticky note, the ink slightly faded but clear enough to read. My hands trembled as I grabbed the landline, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I punched in the numbers, praying that the line would even work. It did. The call connected on the first ring. Hello. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, calm, almost as if they had been expecting me. I swallowed hard. Yeah, hi, I stammered, my voice unsteady. Water dripped from my hair, from my skin, pooling beneath me. My name is Steve. I'm at the AIRBNB. I forced myself to glance back toward the door. My stomach twisted. The kid, I whispered. There's a kid by the pool. The silence that followed was suffocating, thick with an unspoken weight, as if the very air in the room was holding its breath. Then the voice returned, calm, steady, but undeniably commanding. Listen carefully. Lock all the doors and windows. Do not under any circumstances look outside. Someone will be there shortly. Then nothing. The line went dead. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I sprang into motion, moving through the house in a frenzy, locking every door, securing every window. My fingers fumbled with the latches, trembling as I pulled the curtains shut, one after the other. But as I neared the last window, the one overlooking the pool, something clawed at the edges of my resolve. Curiosity. It was an itch, an unbearable urge gnawing at the back of my mind, overriding every survival instinct screaming at me to obey the rules. My breath hitched as I hesitated then, almost against my own will. I lifted the corner of the curtain, just a little. The boy was still there, but he had moved. He no longer sat at the pool's edge. He stood now, back straight, feet planted firmly against the damp concrete, his back turned to the house. Water dripped from his skin, pooling around his bare feet in a perfect, unbroken circle. But something was wrong. He hadn't been in the pool. The realization hit me like ice, my throat tightening as if something unseen had wrapped around it. And then he moved. It wasn't a twitch or a shift of weight, but something slower, more deliberate. A turn. I dropped the curtain and stumbled backward, my pulse hammering against my ribs. Then the doorbell rang. My body locked up, a wave of raw primal fear seizing my limbs. My first thought, had she come back? The woman in maroon? My fingers hovered over the doorknob, uncertain. But when I dared to glance through the peephole, what I saw was somehow worse. Two men. They stood rigidly on the porch, clad in identical black suits, their faces unreadable, completely void of emotion. There was something uncanny about them, something off, though I couldn't quite place it. I never got the chance to decide whether to let them in. They already had a key. Without hesitation, they unlocked the door and stepped inside, their movements practiced, efficient, almost mechanical. They didn't acknowledge me, didn't even glance in my direction. One immediately strode toward the backyard, vanishing through the sliding glass door, while the other remained stationed by the entrance, a silent sentinel. I caught glimpses of the equipment they carried, devices unfamiliar, alien in design, sleek and metallic, yet somehow wrong, like relics from a future that didn't belong here. I sank onto the couch, my wet swim trunks soaking into the fabric, my body rigid as I listened. Strange noises drifted in from the backyard, soft, incomprehensible. Once I swore I heard laughter, a child's laughter, light and airy, curling through the air like smoke. But before I could even process the sound, it was cut off, replaced by something else, a high-pitched whine. It slithered through the walls, through my bones, a frequency so sharp it set my teeth on edge, making my skull throb with pressure. 2 hours passed before the man from the backyard returned. Something was different about him. His suit was dry, yet wrinkled in ways that defied logic, as if the very fabric had been twisted and compressed in places it shouldn't be. A thin trickle of blood ran from one nostril, stark against his pale skin. His eyes, when they finally met mine, were empty. "It's safe now," he said. His voice was flat, hollow, like a recording played back at the wrong speed. And then, just like that, they left. The door shut behind them with a quiet final click, and I stood there unmoving, waiting until the distant hum of their car faded completely before I let myself breathe again. The house was silent once more. Cautiously, I approached the window and peeked outside. The pool was still there, still impossibly blue, still glistening under the fading sunlight. But something about it had changed. The water was still, too still, not a ripple, not a wave. It wasn't just undisturbed, it was unnatural, frozen in time, like a photograph of water rather than the real thing. The tropical heat should have stirred it, the evening breeze should have ruffled its surface, but it remained eerily motionless. I stepped back, unease coiling in my stomach like a living thing. After the pool incident, the house itself felt different. Every creak of the floorboards, every shifting shadow in the corners of my vision, every faint reflection in the windows, everything felt purposeful, like the house was watching. Waiting. The sun had begun to set, its golden light stretching long and thin across the walls, bleeding into hues of deep red. The colors pooled along the floor, staining the furniture, painting the house in a shade uncomfortably reminiscent of dried blood. My stomach twisted with hunger, but the thought of eating made my throat tighten. Still, I needed something. I hesitated before stepping into the kitchen, my hands clammy as I reached for the cabinets. Inside, I found an assortment of food, but none of it felt right. Canned goods sat in neat rows, their labels faded beyond recognition. Cracker boxes looked pristine on the outside, yet bore expiration dates from 3 years ago. A lone box of cereal rattled strangely when I picked it up, not the soft, familiar shuffle of flakes and grains, but something sharper, heavier, something that shouldn't have been inside. Slowly, I set the box back down. My appetite vanished. The last traces of sunlight were disappearing now, the sky outside darkening, shadows stretching long and deep through the house. And then, rule number 4 echoed in my mind. A whisper against my skull. Don't go outside after dark. Through the kitchen window, I watched as the last golden slivers of daylight faded behind the trees, swallowed by an encroaching darkness that felt almost alive, thicker than it should have been, like a dense, liquid shadow seeping into every corner of the world. I checked my phone again, but the screen remained void of service, the signal stubbornly absent. The numbers on the display glowed coldly in the dim light. 8:47 p.m. Still hours to go before morning. I needed a distraction. Anything to drown out the silence pressing against the walls. I reached for the remote and switched on the TV. Static flickered across most channels, a grainy, humming void. All except one. A local station was playing what seemed to be old cartoons, but something was wrong with them. The characters' movements were too abrupt, their limbs jerking unnaturally, as if puppeted by invisible strings. Their voices were slightly distorted, the pitch subtly off, warping into something unfamiliar. And their eyes, too large, too focused, seemed to track my every movement, following me wherever I went. I turned the TV off. The house settled around me, sinking into the deep, rhythmic groans of aged wood adjusting to the cool night air. But beneath those ordinary creaks and shifts were other sounds. Unfamiliar ones. Soft, indistinct, something that might have been footsteps in the attic. A sharp memory resurfaced in my mind. Rule number 5, never go into the attic no matter what you hear. Then, another noise, a delicate scraping sound, fingernails on glass, slow, deliberate, somewhere upstairs, and beneath it all, almost too faint to be real, laughter, the laughter of a child. My pulse quickened as I glanced at my watch. 9:23 p.m. For the briefest moment, the numbers wavered, distorting into strange, flickering symbols before resetting back to normal. I blinked hard, my chest tightening. The exhaustion was setting in, twisting reality at the edges. I needed sleep. At least in sleep, time would pass faster. But sleep didn't come easily. The bed was comfortable, but my body refused to relax. Each time I drifted close to unconsciousness, some sound, a whisper, a creak, a distant murmur, would yank me back to full awareness. Even the ocean waves outside, which should have been soothing, felt unsettling. Their crash against the shore followed no natural rhythm, no steady pulse, but something irregular, something unnatural, like a message, like Morse code. When sleep finally claimed me, it was shallow and restless, a fitful half-dream that left me feeling even more drained. And in that uneasy haze, I saw him, the boy from the pool. But in the dream, his head was turning, slowly at first, then faster, spinning, once, twice, over and over, twisting in a grotesque spiral, as if unhinged from the limits of bone and flesh, rotating like a corkscrew, again and again and again. I woke with a violent jolt. My body was covered in cold sweat, my breath sharp and ragged. I turned my head toward the bedside clock. The numbers glowed a deep, unnatural red. 3:33 a.m. Something had woken me. I lay frozen, ears straining against the thick silence, listening. Then a noise. A soft, deliberate sound from downstairs. Someone was moving in the kitchen. My breath caught in my throat, a sharp spike of fear running through me. My mind scrambled, searching for logic, for reason, until a memory surfaced, clawing its way forward like something buried alive. Rule number 3. If you wake up in the middle of the night and see a man in your kitchen, don't freak out. He will be gone by morning. My entire body screamed at me to stay in bed, to squeeze my eyes shut, pull the blanket over my head, and wait for sunrise. But something inside me, something stubborn, something foolish, wouldn't let it go. I had to see. Slowly, carefully, I slid out of bed, my bare feet pressing against the cool floor. Every creak of the wood beneath me sent a jolt of tension through my spine as I crept toward the bedroom door. The hallway stretched before me, dark and silent, but from the staircase, a faint glow pulsed, spilling upward from below. It wasn't the warm glow of a lamp or the artificial flicker of a TV. It was different, softer, organic, bioluminescent. Heart hammering, I moved forward, pressing my body to the wall, my breath shallow as I descended step by step. The glow intensified as I neared the kitchen, bathing the walls in an eerie, pale blue. And then I saw him, standing at the counter, his back to me. At first glance, he might have looked human, but the longer I stared, the more wrong he became. He wore an old-fashioned suit, the kind you'd expect to see in photographs from a century ago. But it didn't fit quite right, too tight in some places, too loose in others, as if his body wasn't shaped the way it should be. And he was tall, too tall. His head nearly grazed the ceiling, his frame stretched unnaturally thin. His movements were stiff, unnatural, like a puppet being manipulated by unseen strings. He appeared to be preparing something on the counter, his long, bony fingers working methodically. I couldn't see his face. Don't freak out. He will be gone by morning. I swallowed hard and took a slow step backward, moving with the kind of deliberate care one uses around a wild animal. But I wasn't careful enough. A floorboard shifted beneath my weight, the faintest creak breaking the silence. And then he stopped, completely. No slow pause, no gradual movement. He just froze, like a mannequin, like a photograph. And then, ever so slowly, his head began to turn. Not his body, just his head. Pivoting toward me with an unnatural slowness, stretching the moment into something unbearable. I ran. I bolted up the stairs, taking them two at a time, the house warping around me in a blur of shadow and light. My feet barely touched the ground as I lunged into my bedroom, slamming the door shut behind me, my breath ragged and uneven. I dove under the covers, curling in on myself, heart pounding so violently I thought it might shake the bed frame. I waited, listened. No footsteps followed. No sound at all. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating, pressing against my ears like cotton. And at some point, somewhere between fear and exhaustion, sleep finally claimed me again. The next thing I knew, sunlight was spilling through the window, casting golden beams across the floor. I went downstairs cautiously, my throat parched, a deep thirst clawing at my insides. I needed water, desperately. The kitchen was silent, undisturbed, as if no one had set foot in it for days. Everything remained exactly as it had been before, except for one thing. On the counter sat a single teacup, delicate and pristine, filled with a dark liquid that sent thin curls of steam into the morning air. The sight of it made my skin prickle, but it was the small note placed beside it that made my breath hitch. The handwriting was eerily flawless, each letter meticulously formed, as if written by something that didn't understand human imperfection. You weren't supposed to look. A cold shiver crept down my spine. My hands trembled as I picked up the teacup and carried it to the sink. I refused to acknowledge the nagging whisper at the back of my mind, urging me to taste it. Instead, I tilted the cup, watching the dark liquid spiral down the drain. But as it vanished, a thin, iridescent film clung to the porcelain, shimmering unnaturally. Then, to my horror, it began crawling back up the drain like a living thing before slowly dissolving into nothing. I didn't touch the cup again. My phone was still useless, the signal a stubborn void. But something was happening to the time display. It wasn't just shifting, it was breaking. The numbers flickered and jumped, skipping forward by hours, then reversing, then displaying sequences that didn't belong. Twin 561, the year, the time? A meaningless glitch? I didn't know, but I knew I couldn't rely on it anymore. I tried to track time by watching the sunlight filter through the windows, but even that betrayed me. The day passed in an unnatural rhythm, the sun crawling across the sky too fast, as if something had wound the world forward on an invisible reel. Or maybe it was just me. Maybe fear, exhaustion, and the weight of sleepless nights had twisted my perception, warping the hours into something unrecognizable. But either way, evening was approaching far sooner than it should have. I needed supplies, food, water, maybe even a weapon, something to make me feel less helpless. But as I made my way toward the door, Rule 4 slithered into my thoughts, cold and unwavering. Don't go outside after dark. And dark was coming. Fast. I swallowed my growing panic and forced myself to focus. One last sweep of the house before sunset. One last chance to find anything that might explain what was happening. And that's when I made my fatal mistake. I went upstairs. She was waiting for me. At the end of the hallway stood a little girl, no older than 6 or 7. She shouldn't have been there. Her pigtails hung at uneven lengths, one slightly lower than the other, as if whoever had tied them didn't quite understand symmetry. She held a teddy bear, small and threadbare, but there was something wrong with it. The shape wasn't right. The limbs were too long. The button eyes reflected a strange, impossible light, one that wasn't coming from the dim bulbs above. But it was her own eyes that rooted me in place. Dark, bottomless, hollow pits that seemed to drink in the light around them, pulling it inward, devouring it. A sickening wave of dread rolled through me, my instincts screaming, clawing, begging me to move, to run. But the rules had kept me alive. Rule 6. If you walk up the stairs and see a little girl holding a teddy bear, go into the first door on your left. Take a toy from the box. Place it in front of the girl. Then leave. Do not stay. Do not speak. Do not look too long. The first door on the left. I forced myself to turn, slow and measured, keeping her in the corner of my vision. The hallway stretched before me, unfamiliar, its walls pressing in closer than I remembered. The door was there. But some part of me knew, deep in my bones, I could have sworn this hallway had been arranged differently before. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. The air around me felt heavy, thick with something unseen, but I couldn't hesitate. The room beyond was barely more than a closet, its walls pressing in tightly, empty except for a single cardboard box resting in the center of the floor. The box looked ancient, its edges frayed, water-stained, and softened by time. Yet something about it felt off. I stepped closer, my pulse pounding, and peered inside. Toys, dozens of them, all old, decades old. Their colors faded, their surfaces worn, but that wasn't what made my stomach turn. Each one was wrong in some subtle, skin-crawling way. A porcelain doll with too many fingers curled unnaturally around its own dress. A tiny toy car whose windows weren't just painted black but seemed to reveal a void, an endless abyss inside. A wooden train that, when I touched it, radiated warmth. Too much warmth, like flesh burning with fever. I couldn't afford to be picky. Rule 6 hadn't specified what kind of toy I needed, only that I had to take one. I reached in blindly, my fingers brushing against something smooth, solid. I pulled it out. A small boat. At first glance, it looked like a child's simple wooden toy. But as I ran my fingers over its surface, a sickening realization set in. It wasn't wood. It felt denser, colder, like something once alive. Bone. My breath caught, my throat tightening, but I had no time to second guess. I turned back toward the hallway, and my stomach dropped. The girl hadn't moved, but her head had. It was twisted at an unnatural angle, her neck bending in a way no humans should. Those bottomless black eyes bore into me, and I forced myself not to meet them directly. Step by careful step, I approached. I bent down, placing the small bone boat at her feet, making sure my fingers didn't linger. My skin prickled, an unseen pressure settling over me, as if the very air in the house was watching, waiting. I backed away, slowly, then toward the stairs. Run, run, run. Every muscle in my body screamed for me to sprint, to get away, to tear down those steps 2 at a time. But I knew better. I forced myself to walk, each step an agonizing test of will, until I reached the living room. Only then did I collapse onto the couch, my breath ragged, my pulse thundering in my ears. 15 minutes. I checked my watch. That was all I had to do, wait for 15 minutes. The house had fallen completely silent. Not just the usual quiet of an empty room, but something deeper, unnatural. No creaking wood, no distant waves crashing outside, not even the soft hum of the refrigerator. Only the sound of my own breath, sharp and uneven, and the relentless tick, tick, tick of my watch. It was slowing down. 14 minutes. The silence pressed in on me, growing thicker, heavier, as if something unseen was wrapping around my skull. 13 minutes. A new sound. A low, almost imperceptible humming. It was coming from upstairs. 12 minutes. The room was dimming, the light fading even though the sun hadn't set yet. The air itself seemed to darken, shadows stretching unnaturally along the walls. 10 minutes. The humming grew louder, shifting into something more structured. A melody, a lullaby, one I almost recognized. 8 minutes. The temperature plummeted. My breath curled in ghostly white wisps before me. My fingers felt numb, my skin prickling with the bite of unseen frost. 5 minutes. The humming stopped. A silence more suffocating than before swallowed the house. Then, a new sound, a slow, dragging noise. Something was moving upstairs. 3 minutes. Footsteps. Soft, light footsteps descending the stairs. 2 minutes. They stopped. Right at the bottom. I didn't dare look. I kept my eyes locked on my watch, willing the seconds to move faster, my entire body rigid with terror. 1 minute. A breath. Not mine. Directly behind me. Time's up. I lifted my head, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. She was still there. She was supposed to be gone. Rule 6A. If the girl doesn't leave, run. I bolted. My hands fumbled with the locks, my fingers clumsy, shaking too hard to grip properly. Behind me, the girl made a noise. Not a giggle, not a child's laughter. Something older, something jagged, metallic, scraping against bone. The door. I wrenched it open and stumbled onto the porch, gasping for air, the weight of the house finally releasing me. And that's when I realized the sun had already set.